Recorded Books presents Life Sentence, the brief and tragic career of Baltimore's deadliest gang leader, by Mark Bowden, narrated by L.J. Ganser. A quote from Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. So that in the nature of man we find three principal causes of quarrel. First, competition. Secondly, diffidence, self-defense. Thirdly, glory. The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation, for trifles. Preface. This book began early in 2021 with an invitation from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore, which was eager to talk about its efforts to combat that city's shocking street violence. The prosecutors I met were rightly proud of the work they were doing to take violent gangs off the street, and I assumed they had invited me in hopes that I might write something about it. They did have a good story to tell, and when I asked them for a specific example, they told me about Trained to Go, a Sandtown gang run by a young man with the unlikely name Montana Baronet. The gang, mostly teenagers, had terrorized its West Baltimore community throughout the previous decade. TTG had been linked to 20 or more killings and convicted and sentenced as a group for 10 of them. It was a rich opportunity. I knew that the story of how TTG was investigated, arrested, and prosecuted would be fascinating in itself, and journalists rarely get such willing cooperation from law enforcement, especially federal agencies. But what interested me more was a bigger and more important story. Who was this Montana Baronet? How did he become who he became? A young man, barely out of his teens, known to the Baltimore police as the city's #1 trigger puller. I had started my career as a reporter in Baltimore. One of the first major stories I wrote was a series about life in a West Baltimore high-rise housing project, which I lived in, off and on, for a week. I was familiar with Baronet's home turf of Sandtown. It had long been considered one of the worst neighborhoods in the city, an exemplar of intractable urban failure and neglect. It was the backdrop for much of David Simon's series, The Wire, which had begun airing almost 20 years earlier. Why was it still that way? Why was it so seemingly impossible to change? These questions were bigger than the specifics of this story. There were neighborhoods and characters like Sandtown and Baronet in cities all over America, where rates of homicidal violence are an ongoing national disgrace. So I set out to find answers, framing this book chapter by chapter as part of the larger story. There was Baronet's greased path into drug dealing and murder, starting with his family and childhood circumstances, which pulled him in a direction that would have been hard to resist, even though most young men born in such circumstances do. There was the long racist history of Baltimore itself, the intentionality with which Sandtown was created. That long story intersected with my own upbringing as part of the privileged baby boomer white caste in the city's northern suburbs, just 10 miles by map, but in all other respects, a whole world away. I looked into the ambitious, expensive, and ultimately futile effort in the first decades of this century to rebuild and revivify Sandtown, and examine the perverse role played by the internet and social media in cheering on violent gang behavior. Perhaps the most important discovery was that Baronet and his TTG crew were not, as prosecutors and cops suggested, outliers or dangerous psychopaths. They were essentially normal teenagers in an abnormal environment, one that Baltimore, and other cities, had built and sustained very deliberately over centuries. TTG was perfectly adapted to its habitat. To better understand that story, I read a wider range of books and papers, and interviewed more academic experts than for any other book I have written. Relevant parts of that research and reporting are cited throughout in the text and in source notes. Ultimately, this isn't a story about an unusual group of young men. It is the story of young men growing up in a place where murderous violence has become a way of life.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?